In any case, we'll take a little bit of a simplistic look at some of the activity we've seen on the internet over the last week or so. And John, you have the first item here. Zero Access is...
Zero Access, we haven't looked at it in a long time. And so I thought I'd get a screenshot of what it looks like, the activity that we've been seeing. And from the chart here, you can see it's definitely on a kind of declining, continuous declining trend here, which is good. I haven't really, it was just one of those things that came to mind, today. So I hadn't really done any more investigation into what's going on with Zero Access. We know Zero Access was a big click fraud activity. They also had some Bitcoin mining operations, I think, in there that they were engaged in. But there were various takedown operations. I think one of those big dips in there was one of those takedown operations where it resurged. And I think Microsoft did one where the botnet operators actually raised a little virtual white flag saying, okay, we give up. I don't know if they actually gave up right away, because I think we saw a little bit more activity emerge.
Yeah,
again.
there was some additional use, not additional recruiting, but additional use of the existing through the P2P network, even though the sort of the basic command and control had been taken out.
Right. But this trend is indicating that I would think that there's less bots involved. Either they're gone altogether or they've moved on to ports that we don't know about, which I don't think is the case. But it's definitely a downward trend here, so I guess we'll keep an eye on it. Maybe we'll do a little more study and see if we can get more information on what's been going on in that space for next week.
Yeah. Definitely an encouraging sign. What's interesting, we don't have the comparison here, but we've been following the configure activity as well, and it has been also going down, but not like this. And that kind of surprises me. I'm not sure if it's just because the configure is kind of on perhaps the old XP machines to a large extent, and because it's been around, quite a bit longer, farther back. And for those that they're not getting the automatic updates, whereas I think the larger user base associated with this is perhaps has the automatic updates, and they've been getting cleaned out as time goes on. I'm speculating on this. I don't really have a stronger explanation for it. So.
Right.
All right, next item here is scan sources and probes on port 32764 TCP. This is exactly what we covered last week here. This is associated with some backdoors on several router brands associated with Cisco, Linksys, Netgear, Diamond. I understand at least in some circumstances there are some patches around this. At least in one circumstance, the patch wasn't really a patch. It would kind of hid the back door a little bit more. But you can go ahead and take a look at the URL that's listed there to Synactive and take a look at the presentation, because it does provide a little additional insight. And there's a pointer to GitHub. And this is actually from last year, where it described a lot of the details of specific models that exhibited this and a number of models that don't exhibit the problem. But in any case, the sources here are coming from a variety of consumer source addresses. That is indicating that it is actually home devices, home routers that are basically infected and participating in the scanning activity. And the date that I'm pointing out here, by the way, April 18th, 2014. We're looking at a year of activity here. April 18th is the date of this particular presentation that's posted online. So it gives a little bit of a window. Perhaps some of this activity further back was actually associated with research, or maybe that's what prompted the research into this activity. And then there have been some periodic probes since then, but we're seeing clearly a resurgence of activity. And again, the scanning activity is originating from a number of consumer addresses, indicating that it is basically botnet behavior. Next item here is scan probes on port 11211 TCP. This is associated with basically a memory caching service that is generally used associated with web caching. The sources here are all from a common US-based provider. Basically, I think I'm going to loosely use the term cloud service provider. It's really sort of an ISP, but in any case, there is some recent vulnerability notices associated with this particular application. In particular, CVE 2000, actually this dates back a little bit, it says 2011 4971. I think there was actually some recent update associated with this, but originally it was published on December 12th, 2014. This is a case where it allows remote attackers to cause a denial of service attack. which is a little bit, it's not a remote code execution, so I'm not really sure what would be motivating a lot of probing activity around this. Again, I'm a little bit sort of speculating about the sort of the cause and effect here. In any case, we saw activity that's kind of been spiky, periodic, daily type activity starting around the middle of November, and then it's continuing on, has gotten a little bit denser in the last few weeks here. So that activity, to a large extent, attributed to a single provider, a number of addresses in that provider performing that activity. So there's a chance it's basically a researcher investigating the presence of this port activity, but nevertheless, that port really shouldn't be exposed to the internet. So if you're using, I guess my recommendation is to basically scan all the ports of any services you have, servers that you have exposed to the internet, and make sure that you're not exposing services that don't really need to be there. Next item here is bytes on source port 1900 UDP. This is a simple service discovery protocol, and it's one of the well-known ports associated with basically the distributed reflection denial of service attacks. What I'm showing here is actually the last 200 days or so of activity, where this activity really kind of started around July 26, 2014, and we've seen a sort of, not a steady, but we've certainly seen an upward trend in terms of using this port for denial of service attack activity. And so what I thought I would do, since we're looking at one of the ports here that's commonly used for these reflection attacks, to basically look at a composite of the ports that are used commonly in these reflection type of attacks. These aren't necessarily the only ports that would be used. The ports we're showing here are basically port 0. Port 0 is associated with packet fragmentation for the most part, so it's not really a port in itself. It's really associated with contributions from a lot of these other ports that are used. Port 1900, port 123, that's network time protocol, port 53, that's DNS, and there is some legitimate DNS traffic out there. Port 161 UDP, that's simple network management protocol, and then port 19 UDP, that's character generator or charging. Basically what we can see are some clear sort of evolutional phases in this activity, and we're looking back at the last 30 months, about 2.5 years, similar to what we were looking at with the zero-day activity just recently.
Zero access.
Yes, zero access, zero-day being a different thing. So this dates back to about June 2012. The first port that we saw here was DNS. We saw, and you can see, this might have been sort of what you'd expect from DNS activity way back then. There was actually a little bit of reflection attack activity going on at the time. As time went on, around May 2013 or so, we started to see character generator pop into the scene, and that's been increasingly used. And then you also see a sort of what I would call a relatively significant increase in the fragmentation of packets in that case, because character generator is able to generate basically multiple packets of response activity.
A lot of junk it spits out. There's a lot of fragmentation we pick up with character generator.
Absolutely. Yeah. Later in 2013, and then into the beginning of 2014, that was when the monolith command was discovered, associated with a network time protocol that created a significant amount of amplification. And you can see that really spiked up through the roof for a period of time, and then work was done to try to patch down or put protective measures into place so that the monolith command could be used as a part of the amplification activity. That did put a little bit of a damper on use of a network time protocol, but it certainly is still continuing up to this day, and sometimes significant spikes. The most significant spikes tend to be still associated with network time protocol. And then it was right around in August 2014, as we were just looking at a little bit earlier, where the port 1900 simple service discovery protocol started contributing to this, and we're seeing some more significant contributions here with that dark green activity. And more generally, just looking at over the last 2.5 years, as we progress forward, a continuing increase in trends in terms of the number of attacks that are taking place and the size of attacks that are taking place. And just as a reference point, I think at any point in time, you could probably see on the order of, I'm going to guess, somewhere between 12 and 20 different denial of service attacks that are going on at any given time that I would describe as significant enough to, basically kind of put a blip on the radar. And also of significance here is there's no break. It's not as if there's an attack occasionally. Occasionally you hear about them in the press, But the fact is, attacks are going on all the time to a variety of different targets. And if you'd seen, I guess we had debated whether we were going to talk about the Lizard Squad stressor. There were a lot of addresses, I think 3,900 addresses that it identified as being targets in those attacks. These are not associated with those attacks, but it's very indicative of the same type of, sort of the target profile. So I'm sure there are plenty of articles out there on that topic, and perhaps we can talk about that a little bit more next week. But certainly very similar types of behavior. Next item here, scan probes on port 7001 TCP. And help me out, Matt.
It's related to cache managers for Oracle WebLogic.
Okay, so we were talking about the Oracle patches earlier, and there's a possibility that this is related. And we have a little bit of additional evidence to kind of support that. We're looking at 90 days of activity, and there's been some very regular scanning activity on this port. And it's almost, not all of it, but a good portion of it attributable to the same source. It's a specific source coming from China, and it's also probing pretty consistently on port 110, port 1433, port 1521, 1521 being Oracle database, port 1723, 3328, 3306, and 8081. So these are really basically email, database interfaces, and proxies, and actually a point-to-point tunneling protocol as well. That's the 1723. So in any case, looking for a variety of things, possibly accesses a system for a variety of purposes here. Looking at the top 10 most probed ports, no real surprises here. There haven't been really any significant changes from the last week. Port 53 UDP has kind of popped up on the list, moved up a little bit, but that's not unusual to see scanning activity oftentimes looking for open DNS resolvers. At the top of the list, port 135 TCP, followed by 9064, 9064 being basically a proxy application, followed by port 23 and port 22 TCP. Those are command line access, Telnet and SSH respectively, followed by 1900 UDP. We've already talked about that one. 8080 TCP, proxy access. 445 TCP, we talked a little bit earlier about the configure, and then followed by 3389 TCP, that's remote desktop protocol, and then finally 1433, which is Microsoft SQL database. Looking at the most sources, top 10 with the most sources doing the probing, port 23 way up at the top of the list here. I did take a look at how that's trending. It actually is slightly down from when we had talked last week, but still way up. And this is basically scanning for vulnerable devices, Internet of Things devices, if you will, home routers and security surveillance, camera DVRs and such. And then followed by port 445 TCP, 27015 UDP, basically a P2P application, and then followed by 6881 UDP. And we also have 6881 TCP on the list here. Those are both associated with BitTorrent. We're going to take a little bit closer look at that in a moment. We have 1900 UDP, which we already talked about, and then just a few different ICMP ports. ICMP echo request happens to be on the list here, which is oftentimes used to probe, to identify hosts and perhaps do probing for other things as well. So taking a closer look at port 6881 UDP, we're looking at the last 90 days, and there is, again, this is generally associated with BitTorrent. It could be some other application that has some similar characteristics. But in any case, we have seen a significant increase in that activity over the last 90 days, really kind of starting, well, we had a little bit of a bump starting up around mid-November, and then a bigger kicker up around Thanksgiving. So I'm thinking this is perhaps associated with some sort of a new game. First inclined to think that it's innocuous, not really a security issue. The participants here are a variety of consumer participants, but it does need a little more investigation. There's a possibility that this is related to maybe a command and control associated with Internet of Things, but I think that's perhaps stretching it. That would be, I would put that in the category of conspiracy theories.